And now our talk on biophilia. I would like to introduce Allison Miller. Allison is a professor in the Department of Biology at St. Louis University and a member and principal investigator at the Danforth Plant Science Center. She is a research associate at the Missouri Botanical Gardens, and her research program focuses on understanding evolution and the plasticity in perennial, long-lived crops and emerging perennial candidates for domestication. Long-term goals of her work are to improve existing perennial crops and develop new ones to support regenerative agricultural systems. Ongoing projects focus on grapevines, perennial, herbaceous grasses, legumes, and sunflower relatives. Originally from the Chicago area, Allison became passionate about plants through trips to nearby prairie patches and summer vacations in northern Wisconsin. She earned her bachelor's and master degrees in botany from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and Colorado State University. She holds a PhD in ecology, evolution, and population biology from Washington University in St. Louis. She lives in St. Louis, Missouri with her husband and two children. Allison, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to learn about this program and really happy for the opportunity to share some of our work. So thanks for the invitation and thanks everybody for coming today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I've got a few slides that some places you guys might recognize. The general topic today is biophilia, which I think of as the love of nature, but we will define it in just a bit. So I live within walking distance of Forest Park. This is a picture I took yesterday, and this is what the park looks like right now. This may be true for some of you on this call. During the pandemic and the shutdown, we've had an opportunity to spend more time than usual in Forest Park and in many of the surrounding natural areas, which has been really a great gift of this past year, which, as we all know, has been pretty challenging. So although this is what Forest Park looks like today, in other times of the year, it's been this beautiful, lush, very colorful oasis for walking and for running and for reconnecting with nature. And I'm really grateful to Forest Park and Forest Park Forever for providing this oasis in the city. But when I think about biophilia, that is immediately where my mind goes, is to a place like Forest Park. So the concept of biophilia is this idea of a love of life and the living world. Biophilia is a book written by E.O. Wilson, who's a very well-known biologist. Actually, he studies ants. He's a myrmecologist at Harvard. And in this book, he defines biophilia as the innate tendency in human beings to focus on life and lifelike process. To an extent still undervalued in philosophy and religion, our existence depends on this propensity. Our spirit is woven from it. Hopes rise on its currents. So what I'd like to talk about today is biophilia and what it's been for me recently. And then I'd like to challenge us to think about how we might apply this concept of biophilia in agriculture and agricultural systems. And that might seem like a bit of a leap, but please bear with me because I think we're actually moving in that direction more than we might think. So where does this love of life and the living world come from? Is it an inherent attribute that you're born with, or is it something that develops over time, or both? So this is me in my house in the Chicago suburbs when I was a kid, and I have always been interested in nature and in plants, and I'm not really sure why that is. Neither of my parents are biologists or scientists, but I have been drawn to the natural world since I was a kid. And now that I'm a parent, I've spent a fair amount of time with my kids in nature as well. And I think it's becoming increasingly accessible, and we can actually get to know nature and natural systems in ways that weren't really possible back in the 1970s and 80s when I was a kid. So these are our kids in Forest Park, and one of the things that they were drawn to most strongly are birds. So those of you that are familiar with this area may recognize the great egret. This is a beautiful, majestic bird that's they're gone now, but in the summer are quite common. And so our kids started noticing these great egrets, as well as blue herons and eastern kingbirds and yellow-crowned night herons and black-crowned night herons and green herons. And there's just all sorts of incredible bird diversity, even just here in the city of St. Louis. I think there's something like over 200 species of birds that visit Forest Park each year. I'm not a bird person. I'm not an ornithologist by training. I actually know nothing about birds, but I learned during the course of the pandemic through this app called Merlin. And I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this, but the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has developed this really wonderful app that you can access on your phone or on your computer. And it's a very easy way. It asks a few questions like what color are the birds, is the bird that you're seeing? Is it swimming, or is it flying, or is it on a branch? Where are you? It just geolocates you based on your phone. And then it'll give you a series of options of birds that it might be based on the date of the access, where you are, and your observations. And it's through this app that we really came to learn the birds of Forest Park during the pandemic. So this idea of accessibility via the web, via our smartphones, I really can't emphasize how transformative this is for biophilia and for appreciating nature. And there's a lot of apps out there like this. Another one that we use commonly is iNaturalist. This is an app that can identify species based on pictures. So it's a little bit difficult to use for birds, but at least for me. But for plants, it's been super handy. So I'm proud to say that I've seen 155 species this season, and recorded it on iNaturalist. And I would encourage anyone who has any interest in this to do this as well. It's really super fun. So some of the species that we've seen, I'll just walk you through a few of my favorites. Members of the sunflower family, and this really interesting obedient plant. These are all actually from Forest Park. Goldenrods and lobelias, ironweeds, and this white snakeroot, Indian peak, Indian pink, golden aster. This is actually a fairly large tree, buttonbush. The cardinal flower is one of my favorites, black-eyed Susans, of course, purple coneflowers. There's just an incredible diversity in the park. Now, some of the families that I've become interested in through my research are also represented in Forest Park. So these are all representatives of the grass family. Big blue stem. This is just if you ever have a chance to look up close, grasses are so crazy. They actually make flowers, but they're very, very small. These yellow things hanging out are the anthers. That's where the pollen is contained. Grasses have evolved to be wind pollinated, and so they have these structures that can disperse pollen easily through the wind. Another interesting grass, Indian grass. Here's a blue wild rye. There are actually over 10,000 species of grasses in the world. They're not quite that many in Forest Park, but a ton of them. And as we'll see in a minute, the grass family is really important from an agricultural perspective. Another important agricultural family that we see in Forest Park is the bean family, or the legume family. Now, believe it or not, this family has even more species than the grass family, over 20,000. Some of the common ones I saw in the park this summer in the bean family, and this is something you can see right now, is in Illinois bundle flower. It makes this really interesting cluster of fruits. If you look closely, each one of these brown things is actually like a little bean pod. It's a bundle of bean pods. That's why it's called bundle flower. and the leaves are all gone now, but these brown structures, fruits are still there. Another member of the bean family, the wild white indigo, Baptisia alba, a Canadian milk vetch, astragalus. So these two families of plants, the grass family and the legume family, are really abundant around our region. But as I mentioned, they're also super important for agriculture. And in every major region of the world where agriculture developed, people domesticated or began growing at least one grass and at least one legume. All right, so back to this concept of biophilia, this love of life and the living world. This is a picture of the tall grass prairie in the Kanza Prairie, which is in central Kansas. This is the largest remaining stand of tall grass prairie in the world. And if you haven't had a chance to go out to the Kanza Prairie, I highly recommend it. It's really an expansive and breathtaking landscape. It's easily accessible from I-70. Definitely worth a stop. But I show this picture because this is what the landscape of much of North America, central North America, the Midwest, looked like prior to the expansion of agriculture. And this is a prairie that consists primarily of perennial plants. Those are plants that live for multiple years. Those plants are primarily herbaceous. So you can see some trees, some woody species here down in the lower lying areas, but most of these plants are herbaceous. The other thing to note about the tallgrass prairie is this is not a landscape of a single species. This is a landscape, as most natural landscapes, I would say actually all natural landscapes are a mixture of many different species growing together. So when we think about this love of life and love of the living world, this is what the living world looked like in our region prior to the expansion of contemporary agriculture. So why does that matter? Well, what I'm interested in talking about today is whether or not we can apply this concept of biophilia to our agricultural systems. So agriculture is the world's largest and most rapidly expanding ecosystem. As such, it's the leading driver of biodiversity loss. So for me, it's really difficult to think about biophilia, love of nature, and conservation without also taking into account this elephant in the room, this giant system of agriculture. So this is a picture of wheat. Wheat is one of the grasses that's been domesticated for human consumption. And it's a hugely important plant. As you know, it's evolved in incredible ways under artificial selection to produce very large seeds that are stalks that are highly productive. And it's supported the growth and expansion of human societies in many places around the world. All right, so if we think about agricultural systems and have in the back of your mind as we discuss this, that tall grass prairie that we just looked at. So whereas the tall grass prairie consists of long-lived plants that are growing in mixtures, most of the agricultural systems that blanket our landscape today are the opposite of that. They consist of short-lived plants like corn, and wheat is in the same category. These are called annual plants. They live for 1 year. So the seed goes in the ground in the spring, plant grows, produces more seeds, it's harvested in the fall, and then that's the end of the growing season for those individuals. And they have to be replanted in the spring. That's called a monoculture. So we have these short-lived plants that are growing in monocultures, just single species across this landscape. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm criticizing the system. This agricultural system is the foundation of human societies today in almost every corner of the world. And it's a hugely productive system that has been increasing in productivity over time. So if we look at this figure here, this is a graph that shows the bushels per acre of corn produced and over the last 100 or so years. And through plant breeding and also agronomic inputs, we can see that the rate of productivity, the number of bushels per acre produced, has just gone up over time, which is great. And it's a tribute to the scientists and the agronomists who have been able to do this, and the farmers, of course, who are working the land. That's a general concept called agricultural intensification. But the reason why I think we need to think about the application of this concept of biophilia to agriculture is that there is a challenge that we're facing, which is that about half of the world's topsoil has been lost in the last 150 years. And this is due in part to the nature of the agricultural systems that we have. So once the corn or wheat is harvested, often the ground lays bare over the winter. That's the case for many acres in our neck of the woods right now. And that can contribute to soil loss and then also to erosion when the rains come. And this is a problem because, as Wes Jackson, who founded the Land Institute, an institution we'll talk about in just a moment, as Wes Jackson says, soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. And so once it's gone, it's gone. And it I think is in our long-term best interest to think about developing agricultural systems that can help preserve soil and perhaps even regenerate it. All right, so let's go back to this tall grass prairie here. So there's an organization that I mentioned, the Land Institute, that has a vision of recreating agricultural systems that mimic natural ecosystems. So again, this tall grass prairie consists of long-lived perennial species that are growing in mixtures. This is a system that has evolved to be sustainable. There is not soil being lost from this system in the way that we're seeing it being lost from agricultural lands. So can we somehow use, and this is what the Land Institute asks, can we use nature as our measure for how to develop agricultural systems that are sustainable? And that's what I will be talking about for the rest of this time. So I mentioned the Land Institute. This is an organization based in Salina, Kansas. It's not too far from the Kanza Prairie. It was started over 40 years ago by Wes Jackson with the idea of developing these sustainable agricultural systems. The Land Institute, if you're at all familiar with it, has gone through a series of evolutions over the last 4 decades. I started working with the Land Institute about 5 or 6 years ago. And what struck me about their work is in the effort to try to develop an agricultural system based on these long-lived plants, they made the point that although agriculture has been going for over 10,000 years, and although perennial herbaceous plants exist in nature, like in this prairie just outside the Land Institute itself, they were never domesticated, or very rarely. There are very few, if any, perennial crops that we could go to build this system. So I was already working in long-lived plants, actually in some fruit and nut trees, and I thought this concept was really interesting, that you could go back to nature, identify perennial herbaceous species, and attempt to domesticate them, to develop them as crops for use in this, what the Land Institute calls a perennial polyculture system, a long-lived system where plants are grown in mixtures. Again, that occurs in nature, but the question is, can we make something like that in agricultural systems that yields at a rate that's economically viable? So the Land Institute has been developing a number of perennial herbaceous crops, one of which shown here on the right. The scientific name is Thinopyrum intermedium. The trade name is Kernza. It's also known as intermediate wheatgrass. So the work of the Land Institute has attracted international attention. And in fact, just this week, the Land Institute on Monday, it was announced that they were awarded a Food Planet Prize. That's a $1 million award that helps to acknowledge and also bolster institutions that are working to reshape the food system. So that is super exciting news for the Land Institute. So having said all of that, what I'm going to introduce now is a project that we're conducting in collaboration with the Land Institute. The work is taking place here in St. Louis, but hopefully you'll be able to see kind of how it connects back to this idea of developing perennial agricultural systems. So when we think about biophilia, again, this connection to nature, this concern for living things and living systems, there's a lot of different ways that we can do this in agriculture. Our work focuses primarily on diversity and sustainability, but I wanted to just draw to your attention some other stuff that's going on as well. So there's this cool concept called prairie strips that several people working, I think primarily in Iowa, have pioneered, although I know this is happening elsewhere. And the idea is to put within a more traditional annual agricultural system strips of wildflowers that can serve as sources, that attractors for pollinators, and also can create diverse root systems that help with the soil, holding the soil and feeding the crop plants. Those are the prairie strips. Another option are cover crops, and cover crops are super interesting. Some of you might be aware of these plants. They literally cover the land during the winter. That's why they're called cover crops. So this picture is a soybean field. Again, this is a traditional annual system. But what's happened is that the farmers sowed into their soybeans a cover crop. There's a number of different species that are used. And then when they harvested the soy, which is what you're seeing here, the cover crops that they had sown into the soybean crop had already started growing, and the ground beneath was covered in this green blanket. And that's something when you drive around today and see green fields, what you're probably looking at are cover crops that will then senesce or die in the spring, and then you will have the annual crops planted back on top of them. But to bring it back again, our focus is on another solution to this challenge of developing more sustainable agricultural systems, which is the development of these perennial herbaceous species. And one of the reasons that we're interested in perennial species is that they make these giant root systems. So I mentioned a plant that the Land Institute is working on, Kernza, or intermediate wheatgrass. It's a relative of wheat. It produces a grain that's edible. It can be made into flour. I've baked with it. It works very well. So this, on the right hand of this picture, is intermediate wheatgrass, or Kernza, this wheat relative, and on the left is a wheat plant. So you can see immediately the difference in the below ground biomass of these two plants. And it's this huge root system that is really what we're after. That's what holds the soil. That's what generates very healthy below ground microbial communities. It helps to retain moisture to prevent erosion, all the while producing a grain above ground that is hopefully economically viable, but certainly edible for people. And it can be harvested in a traditional manner with a tractor, with a combine. So the first question that I had when I started working with the Land Institute, and I heard about these efforts to begin to identify wild perennial species that might be good candidates for domestication and use in agricultural systems, the first question we asked was, well, how many and which wild species in the bean family, Fabaceae, the grass family, Poaceae, and the sunflower family, Asteraceae, how many of them are perennial and herbaceous? So the Missouri Botanical Garden, a gem of the city of St. Louis and a global leader in botanical diversity research, worked with us on this project. And we basically built on on top of this foundation of botanical knowledge that is held within institutions like the Missouri Botanical Garden, to come up with an estimate of how many species of beans are perennial and herbaceous, over 6,000. How many species of grasses are perennial and herbaceous, over 7,800. And in the case of sunflowers, the family is so big and the taxonomy is still being worked out that we haven't yet made it through all of the different subgroups within that family. So we focused on one tribe called the Helianthii. That's the tribe that sunflowers are in, and identified over 800 wild perennial herbaceous species. So remember back in Forest Park, I noted that we had members of both the bean family and the grass family. And of those, there are literally thousands that are perennial and potential candidates for domestication. So another part of this project was working with ethnobotanists to try to understand the indigenous uses for some of these species, as well as their toxicological properties. So whether or not something's been eaten before is important information if you're thinking of advancing this in the domestication pipeline. Also, whether or not something is toxic is important information as well. There's a number of examples in nature where toxic plants have been domesticated to lose their toxic properties, such that they become viable for people. But nonetheless, we still like to know ahead of time, if we can, what we're dealing with. Okay, so on top of that, there's the Land Institute, and the scientists and plant breeders there have been working with a number of different species, perennial species that they're attempting to domesticate for use in these perennial polyculture agricultural systems. Now, I mentioned Kernza already. Another one is rosin weed, Silphium intermedium. Actually, it's Silphium integrifolium. These are wild species that are being actively selected. In other words, breeders are looking for individuals that are making high numbers of seeds, and then they're using those high producing individuals to found the next populations in the hopes of increasing over time the number of seeds that are produced. There are a couple of other ways. There's another way that you can get to a perennial crop, though, and this is super interesting. Many of our major crops today that are annuals, for example, rice and wheat and corn, have wild relatives that are perennial. And so some teams are working to make perennial varieties of major crops like perennial rice, like perennial sorghum. And it's kind of exciting because there are scientific teams on almost every continent right now working on different aspects of perennial agriculture. And it's fun to see the progress that people are making. I was at a meeting in Sweden in 2019 and tried some perennial rice from China, and it was terrific. All right, so what are we doing today? As I mentioned, the first project that we conducted was to set up an inventory, or basically a list of all of the perennial herbaceous species of plant families that are important for agriculture. We're now doing some experimental work to try to see if we can develop a way to speed up the process of domestication in these perennial plants. So remember, agriculture started 10,000 years ago. And so the crops that we grow today have been evolving under artificial selection for 10,000 years-ish. We're starting new with many of these species, and we don't think we have 10,000 years. And I don't think we need 10,000 years to develop new crops for future agricultural systems. So this is an experimental plot that we have at the Shaw Nature Reserve. And Matthew Rubin, shown here on the left, is the research scientist in my group at the Danforth Center who's been leading this work. And Emmeline is a master's degree student at St. Louis University who's recently joined our team and is helping with the work. So the question we're asking now in this experiment is, how can we speed up the process of perennial crop development? And one of the ways we're trying to do this is to ask, can we predict, based on observations made during the earliest life stages at the seed and seedling level, of a perennial plant, can we use those observations to predict what perennial plants will do in the field? So the Danforth Plant Science Center is a global leader in plant phenotyping, that's describing the form of plants, the shape and form and function of plants. And they have a lot of really awesome tools like this automated phenotyper, which I'll show in just a sec, that allows us to look at plants in really great detail. So we picked, together with our collaborators at the Land Institute, about 10 wild species, some of which are already under investigation, like this Silphium integrifolium, the intermediate wheatgrass or Carnza, another one, sainfoin, it's a legume, and then a few others, like this is a perennial alfalfa hybrid, a perennial barley relative, and some Canadian wild rye. And we obtained over 20,000 seeds of these individuals, and we just started what we call phenotyping them, or describing their size and shape. So we started with seeds. We used high resolution scans of seeds to measure seed area, perimeter, and circularity. We monitored germination, timing, and proportion. So this picture was taken in the summer of 2019. This is a team we had in the greenhouses at the Danforth Center, individually hand planting these thousands and thousands of seeds. And then we monitored how quickly they germinated. And we kept track at an individual level the rates of an accession level. So for a pool of seeds, the rates of germination. We use these toothpicks to denote the day that an individual germinated. So every day of this experiment had a different toothpick shape and color, and that's how we tracked when these individual plants actually germinated. We took some of our samples and destructively harvested them so that we could calculate above ground and below ground biomass, and that ratio of above ground growth to below ground growth. And then we replanted these guys into slightly larger pots, and we put them into this automated phenotyper in the Bellwether Phenotyping Center at the Danforth Center. So this is a growth chamber that controls the temperature and the humidity of this large room. There are 1,140 plants in here. And what happens is these plants roll around on this little roller coaster type of thing. They get automatically weighed and watered to a certain level. But the real important thing is that they get their pictures taken from the side and from the top every day. And what that allows us to do is calculate how quickly these are growing. So these are these 10 species that ultimately are going to make their way out to the field, but this is what we did with them before we took them to the field. So when we look at the data from this LemnaTec phenotyper, again, we can see a side view. This is the plant during a single individual during week 1, and this is that same individual during week 5. So you can see there's quite a bit of growth. We can look from the top down and get a picture of that degree of growth. And remember, we're tracking this for individuals. And in the kind of the big picture, what we're trying to ask is, are any of these observations that we make for individuals early on in their life at all predictive of what they're going to do in the field? All right, so a couple of other measures that we took at the Danforth Center, we looked at spectral traits. So we can look at the anthocyanin. These are pigments within the leaf, the chlorophyll index, the FV-FM ratio, which is a measure of photosynthesis. And then once we did all of these very detailed observations at the Danforth Center, we loaded up a U-Haul with all these individual plants and drove them out to our field site, which is at the Shaw Nature Reserve in Gray Summit, Missouri. So this is a site that exists within it's a 10-acre area that's deer fenced. And then we built a smaller, like small mammal fence around it and dug it into the ground and then put landscape fabric over it to try to keep the pests at bay. So once we actually put the plants in the field, then we went through and collected data on flowering time, on height, and on yield, how many seeds are actually produced. So again, just to kind of zoom out here, what we tried to do was use what we call this high throughput phenotyping that took place at the Danforth Center. Started with individual seeds. For each seed, measured its germination, its seed size and weight, its germination timing, spectral signatures, growth rate, etc. And then we took those individuals, kept track of all of them, put them into the field and collected data on flowering time, yield, and height. And we did this for we're doing this for these 10 different species. And this is the only data slide that I will show. But let me just orient you here. This is a covariation matrix that asks for relationships, pairwise relationships between these different things that we looked at. And everything shown in blue are things like the seed traits, the germination traits, leaf traits that we observed at the Danforth Center. Everything shown in red are the spectral signatures that we detected also at the Danforth Center. And then things shown in green are the field traits. Now, this matrix of red and blue boxes, where you see white, there's no relationship. Where you see blue squares, there's a positive relationship. So for example, there's a positive relationship between seed area and overwinter survival, whether individuals make it through the winter, as well as field height. So we can predict based on the area of the seed, the likelihood of overwinter survival and flowering height. There's other traits that are kind of crazy, like seed circularity, how circular a plant is, which is the seed is, which is negatively correlated with those traits. So it's not just the size of the seed that matters, it's actually the shape. So this is kind of our very preliminary data. We haven't published this yet, but we are excited to see that there are relationships between these early life stage traits and what we observe in the field. And just on the right here, there's an example looking at the seed weight on the x-axis and the flowering time. This is kind of what I was saying before. So smaller seeds are flowering later. Larger seeds are flowering earlier. The y-axis here are the days to flowering, the length of time it took for plants to flower. All right, so what's happening next? These plants are still in the ground. They're perennials, of course, so we're gonna go through and collect data next year too. And our long-term hope is that it might be useful to breeders if we can pull out traits that they can look at before they even have to put the plants in the ground. Again, like those seed traits or perhaps some spectral traits that are exhibited by seedlings. That might help them make decisions earlier on which individuals to advance in their breeding trials. We'll see. I mean, that's our hypothesis, but truthfully, we really don't know yet. So if we kind of tie all of this back to this concept of biophilia, the love of nature, the love of natural systems, one quote that E.O. Wilson had is that our hopes rise on its currents. And I think that's the message I want to leave everyone with today, is that understanding and knowing nature, it's becoming easier to do that through things like phone apps and frankly through some additional extra time and not being able to do anything any travel or things like that during the pandemic. It's becoming easier to know the nature around us. And I think that that's really important for our own well-being. But I also think it's important as we think about the the planet and the both natural and agricultural systems that surround us. So the nature that exists isn't, it's not just to be known, but it also holds some potential for remaking things, even as big and as expansive as our agricultural system, in a way that is more sustainable and perhaps can stem soil erosion and still provide the calories that we need. So this picture is a field of intermediate wheatgrass or kernza, that Thinopyrum intermedium, this perennial wheat relative that the folks at the Land Institute are working on, and we are too. This is growing in Kansas. The seed has been harvested. It's been used to make beer. It's been used to make bread. And it is, I think, a very promising beacon for how we might begin to rethink agriculture with a lens of biophilia. Okay, so I want to just share a few acknowledgements before we open it up. This work was conducted largely at the Danforth Plant Science Center, at the Shaw Nature Reserve, at the Land Institute, and at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And we have a wonderful team of scientists and students who have helped at various stages of the process. The project I talked about today has been funded by the Land Institute, by the Malone Family Land Preservation Foundation, by St. Louis University, and the Danforth Plant Science Center. And we're grateful for the support of these institutions and for the opportunity to ask these types of questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was wonderful. I feel like I just learned so much. And if anyone else is able to, please feel free to turn on your cameras so Allison can see your face and know who's watching. We'll be watching the chat so that if anyone has any questions, just type it in the chat and then we'll ask you to unmute. And I think, Matt, you had a question, Matt Ship. Kind of in the middle of the talk, you had been asking about a certain plant.
Yeah, it's just brassicas mustards. They are so heavily researched because their generation time's so fast and you can get so much done with them so quickly. I was wondering if there were any like perennial style of brassicas that could fit that, fit with your research.
Yeah, great question. So the brassica family, the mustards. So this is things like mustard, obviously, and horseradish, and all sorts of interesting stuff. Mustards have not been a major focus of perennial research yet that I know of, but I think they do have a really important role to play in the evolution of our agricultural systems. And at one I think exciting thing that's happening in mustards right now are with cover crops that I mentioned. So many cover crops are mustards.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a pretty exciting one project going on here in St. Louis with a mustard called Pennycress. Yeah, a company known as Covercress, formerly known as Regenix, I think is if I'm getting that right. But yeah, there is some really interesting, like super exciting work happening in mustards as cover crops. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I try to keep in mind there's no one right way necessarily to begin to remake agriculture. Our work is focused on perennial systems, but these cover crops and the prairie strips that I mentioned, those are also really exciting, important efforts underway. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Great question. Looks like we have a question from Sarah S. Sarah, would you like to unmute?
Sure. Hi. Yeah, I'm a designer and not a plant expert whatsoever. So I was listening to your presentation, which I thought you did such a great job of explaining this to someone who doesn't really know anything about plants and agriculture. I was wondering why there's a history of using annual seeds versus perennials from the start in agriculture.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for that very kind comment. And that is an excellent question that is debated a lot among scientists and non-scientists. So why did early agricultural societies tend towards annual plants? There's a number of hypotheses out there. I'll share my my opinion on this. I think what probably happened is that annual plants, their whole strategy is to grow quickly, produce a lot of seeds before they die, and then they die. So if you're a farmer or you're just an individual trying to get seeds, I think the annuals will probably produce more first. And I think that probably caught the attention of the early farmers who probably weren't thinking about perennial systems. They were just thinking about getting some seeds. And I think there was some historical inertia that went along with that as those kind of evolved over time. I do need to mention there's another class of perennials that we didn't talk about today, which are woody perennials, fruit trees and nut trees and grapevines, and those did make it into early agricultural systems. It's just the perennial herbaceous species that didn't.
It looks like we have a question from David. Thanks for your question, Sarah. David Brown, would you like to unmute?
Oh, he said he has no mic, so.
Oh, I see here. Okay. He's asking, how far out in years do you think we might be from some of these perennial wheats, barley, and etc.? Milo?
Yeah, great question. So originally, I think when the Land Institute first kind of doubled down on this concept of domesticating perennials, it was, they were thinking in the hundreds of years. But what we're seeing is some really incredible progress, which is fueled in part by work and funding, but in part by technology. So there's a number of approaches that are really speeding up this process. So one of them I talked about today using this early stage selection, but there's another approach that's really promising called genomic selection, which uses genetic data to predict phenotypic data in these crops. And I know in this intermediate wheatgrass or Kernza, there's a pretty large genomic selection program underway, primarily in Kansas and also in Minnesota. And they're realizing some very quick gains. And when I say gains, what I mean is they are basically seeing this wild plant evolving quickly towards higher yields, which is what farmers need to make this economically viable. So how long is it going to take? I mean, I think we're talking now more in tens of years rather than hundreds of years. And another thing that's driving it is demand. So I'm seeing demand from bakers and from brewers and from growers who are eager to give this thing a shot. And even here in St. Louis, I know there's a few bakers who are wanting to try it. And it's a kind of a chicken and the egg, but the momentum is awesome to see. Even just in the time I've been involved in it, I can see the pace of change and progress is straight up. It's really exciting.
That's a great question. That was on my list too. So just tens of years, that's pretty incredible considering it took thousands to get to where we are now. So looks like we have a question from Anthony.
Hi, yes, thank you, Allison. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Sam, for putting this together. I had two questions. One, and they're both focused on kind of like the commercial gain and how the commercialization strategy of this, since it's going to take 10 to 50 years. Thinking about kind of the policy frameworks for monitoring allelopathy and weediness to enable global strategies for this product to move throughout different pipelines. And the other question was, oh, I wrote it down. Sorry. wrote down right here. Was the allelopathy? Oh, and so how do we think about your work and your colleagues' work and apply it, like the philosophies of biophilia, and think about kind of some of the philosophies with biophilia within the new movements with synthetic biology? So if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. So let's start with the weedy and allelopathy question. So allelopathy is the way I understand it is the exuding of chemicals by plants to inhibit the growth of other nearby plants. Is that the way you're intending to use that?
Yeah. So I was wondering if there's any allelopathy that you all are seeing in your trait work. So excluding out any sort of native plants, that any sort of, since you're doing such a large genomic sequencing or phenotypic sequencing, is there any potential for, say, one of these species out competing with native plants in situ?
Yeah, or escaping, and
Yeah.
so we're not seeing any of that in our plots. However, that is a topic of conversation, and I think there's an interest among people working in this area to develop crops responsibly, and to focus on species that are perhaps don't have a tendency to take over. Now, there's an interesting situation right now. There's a hybrid sorghum that's a perennial sorghum, and one of the parents is is a known like super very weedy thing. Now, this is not to a point where it's being planted on large scales. It's still it's not being planted experimentally for breeding. It's being, I mean, sorry, for harvesting. It's being planted in breeding plots just to kind of move that evolution along. Long story short is that's under investigation, I guess, is the best that I can say. And I haven't seen, I know we are veering away from species we know to be problematic, and I think other groups are as well. But we don't have it all figured out yet. So the other question on synthetic biology. So do you want to define what you mean, just so I make sure I'm answering the right question?
So single point mutations are no longer really the kind of the big concern, and you're creating mutations when you're doing traditional breeding, and since and there's a trend now where you can kind of create a whole new organism from scratch, and then so synthetic biology will be kind of a normalized trend within 50 years when this is very available. Or within tens of years when this is available. So we'll be looking at a future where we have the ability to create a whole new organism from scratch, basically. Like that will be a normalized thing. The policy framework will be there to support that. The ethics will be there and discussed. So how does the work with like the Land Institute, Shaw Nature Reserve, Danforth, how are they discussing the ideas of this work, which is not synthetic biology, but it is in a way, it still dives into those philosophies. How is that feeding those discussions at a higher level in terms of like the overall philosophy? Like since you're already thinking tens of years ahead, how do you chime into those discussions that are already happening on the synthetic biology front?
Yeah, good question. So the synthetic biology that I am familiar with is happening in model systems that are super well understood. And right now, the plants that we're working on are not that. I mean, some of these things we don't even have genomes sequenced yet. So I guess we're further back in the process from those systems, like for example Arabidopsis, or maybe even something like rice, where they're really far advanced. So I hear your point in that it's like things are trending in that direction, and how will this how will this type of work interface with that? I guess the short answer is I don't know. But I can envision a situation. So for example, one of the major things that's happened during the domestication of grasses, the evolution of grasses from wild species to crops, wild species drop their seeds. It's a phenomenon called shattering. You can imagine in nature why that would be adaptive from a dispersal perspective. In agriculture, it's not adaptive. So it's not, and every major grass that's been domesticated, humans have selected for non-shattering, which is that the seeds stay on the plant. So think about a corn cob. When you harvest a corn cob, all the seeds are stuck to the cob. The wild relatives of corn, they drop off. So by way of example, the genes that underlie that trait of non-shattering are known for some systems. So I can imagine a scenario where one might go into a perennial grass candidate and think about editing the genes that underlie shattering such that the plant doesn't shatter. That's probably one way in which this might play out. Now, that's not happening yet, but I don't think we're that far off from that type of thing. It's not happening that I know of.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to speak with you more offline because I'm involved in some of these policy fronts on these sort of overarching ideas. So if there's anything you want to contribute to the policy frameworks, that I'd love to kind of have you at the table.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. Thank you.
Great questions. And I have to say, as someone who isn't involved in science or ag, you guys are making me feel so smart right now because I love talking with smart people. We're running out of time, but I want to take one more question. And Elizabeth, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you for this fascinating talk. I enjoyed it very much. My question is, so what can we do in our own backyards, both to physically and metaphorically as consumers at the grocery store, and what we choose to plant in our yards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably the easiest thing is to plant natives if you can. And the next level would be there are programs, including some at the Land Institute, that are asking people who live in the native areas where these plants occur naturally to collect those seeds and plant them and kind of become stewards of those individual species. So I showed a handful of species today, but you can certainly go to the Land Institute's website and learn more about that. I guess another thing at the grocery store is to keep your ears open for these perennial grains. That's usually how they're discussed, perennial grains. And I suspect we'll be seeing more of these coming along. The one, again, that's furthest along is Kernza. You can buy it online. I don't know if it's being sold in St. Louis yet, but I suspect it will be soon. And then experiment with it. I put Kernza into a recipe for a breakfast pastry that I make that my kids love. And I just like on a whim threw some in, and it was delicious. And it was just a new way to bake. So I guess I would say keep your mind open to the option of baking with perennial grains when it becomes possible. And I don't think we're that far away from that. I would say like single digit years. And really much. Just by attending something like this and just having that biophilia, that love of nature, and thinking about it. I guess that's the one last thing I'd like to say. I think it's too often that agriculture and nature are treated as two distinct entities, that where, one is bad and one is good. But I see so much opportunity to make some gains in agriculture based on our understanding of natural systems. So I hope we can continue to bridge that gap between agriculture and nature, between agricultural scientists and biologists. I see it happening already, and I anticipate it will continue.
Well, I think I'll speak for all of us when we say we're excited to continue following your work and watching this progress. Are there any links or information you'd like us to share for continuing to watch this project?
Yeah, I would continue to follow the Danforth Plant Science Center. The mission of the Danforth Center is to improve the human condition through plant science, and they do a great job with public programming, and it's open to the public, and even now it's virtual. So that's probably the best place to follow this work for now.
Great. Well, I know we're running over on time, but I want to thank you all so much for attending Creative Mornings. Thank you to Allison for being here with us this morning and sharing your wealth of knowledge. And we wish everyone a happy and safe holiday, and we'll be seeing you all in January.
Thanks, Sam.
So much.
Thanks, everybody.
We're going to post